The wind never rested in this part of Wyoming. It howled across the plains like a lonely ghost, stealing the warmth from a man's bones and the peace from his mind. Eli Carter had grown used to that sound. It was the only voice that spoke to him anymore. The sky above him was dull and gray, heavy with the promise of another storm. He worked anyway, his movements slow but steady, mending the fence the last windstorm had torn apart. Each pull of the wire sent a dull ache up his arms, but the pain didn't bother him. Pain meant he was still living. His hands were covered in scars, his gloves worn so thin they might as well have been paper. His face was rough and tanned, lined by the years and by things he didn't talk about. He had been alone on this ranch for months now, ever since the world had turned upside down and left him with 2 children and a grief that had no end. When the last fence post was set, Eli stood up straight, groaning as his back popped. His gaze drifted to the small hill behind the barn. 3 wooden crosses stood there, 2 still new and pale against the brown earth. He walked toward them, his boots sinking into the soft soil. The wind tugged at his coat, whistling through the grass like a mournful song. He stopped in front of the 2 fresh graves, his brother John Carter and John's wife Sarah. They'd been gone 4 months now, taken by a riding accident that still didn't feel real. He knelt and placed a small wildflower he had found that morning on the dirt mound. "I'm trying, John," he said quietly. "I'm trying." The wind carried his words away. He didn't expect an answer. There never was one. He stood and turned toward the small log cabin down the hill. Smoke rose weakly from the chimney. Inside, 2 children waited. John's children, Luke, 9, and Annie, 6. They barely spoke anymore. Neither did he. The cabin that once held laughter and the smell of Sarah's baking had turned cold and silent, like the graves on the hill. When Eli stepped inside, the warmth from the fire barely touched the chill in the air. The place smelled of wood smoke and sorrow. Luke sat on the floor carving a small wooden bird, his small face set in a serious frown. Annie sat wrapped in a blanket by the hearth, her eyes wide and tired. Eli took off his hat and hung it on a peg. "It's cold," he said, his voice rough. "You hungry?" Luke didn't look up. Annie shook her head. Eli's big, rough hands felt useless. He was a man who knew how to break horses and mend fences, but not how to comfort children. Still, he tried. He added a log to the fire, then looked over what little food they had left. Half a slab of bacon, a few potatoes, some onions. "I'll make stew," he said quietly, more to himself than to them. He worked in silence, the knife scraping against the cutting board, the fire crackling softly. When the stew was ready, he gave the biggest portions to the children. They ate quietly. He watched them and felt a deep ache inside him, a mix of guilt and love and helplessness. "It'll be all right," he said, though he didn't believe it. The children didn't answer. The next afternoon, a knock came at the door. Eli opened it to find Reverend Miller standing there, his round face pink from the cold. The preacher smiled in that practiced, polite way he had. "Eli, I thought I'd stop by and see how you and the young ones are faring." Eli stepped aside. The Reverend's eyes swept the small cabin, taking in its sparseness, the quiet children, and the empty shelves. "It's a heavy burden," the preacher said softly. "Raising children alone. The women at the church think perhaps a housekeeper might help, someone to bring warmth and order back into this home." Eli's jaw tightened. "We don't need anyone," he said. "We'll make do." The preacher sighed, setting a small Bible on the table. "Pride can be a sin too, Eli. The Lord helps those who—" "I said we'll make do," Eli cut in, his voice low and final. The Reverend hesitated, then nodded and left, closing the door behind him. Eli stared at the Bible for a long moment, then turned away. That night, the first snow of the season began to fall. It clung to the window panes, soft and white, muting the world outside. Eli fried the last of the bacon with onions and potatoes. The meal was meager, but the children ate quietly, grateful for something warm. When they were done, he watched them climb into their small loft bed. Annie's little voice whispered, "Good night, Uncle Eli." He sat by the fire long after they'd fallen asleep, the flames reflecting in his tired eyes. The loneliness pressed in on him, heavy as a mountain. The only sound was the wind outside, moaning through the cracks in the cabin walls. The next morning, he hitched the wagon and rode into town for supplies. Prairie Creek was a small, dusty settlement, just a few stores and a saloon. When he stepped into the general store, the whispers started right away. "All alone out there," Mrs. Beasley muttered near the pickle barrel. "That man's as wild as the land he works." "Poor children," another woman said. "That ranch is cursed, I tell you." Eli ignored them. He got what he needed: flour, coffee, salt, and paid in silence. The storekeeper's hands trembled as he took the coins. At the far end of the store, a woman watched the scene unfold. Clara Bennett, the new schoolteacher from back east, a widow. Her eyes were soft and steady. She'd heard the stories about the Carter family, the accident, the orphans, the silent brother left behind. But as she looked at Eli, she didn't see a wild man. She saw a tired one, a man carrying a load too heavy for one person to bear. That evening, when the sun sank low over the snowy fields, Clara wrapped a loaf of bread in a clean cloth. It was warm, fresh from her oven, its crust golden brown. She pulled on her coat, tied her scarf tight, and started walking toward the Carter ranch. The wind bit at her face, and the snow crunched beneath her boots. When she reached the small cabin, the windows glowed faintly in the dusk. She hesitated only a moment before knocking. Inside, Eli rose from his chair, surprised by the sound. He opened the door to find a woman standing there, her cheeks red from the cold, her hands holding a cloth-wrapped bundle. "Mr. Carter," she said softly, her voice trembling slightly. "I'm Clara Bennett, the new teacher. I baked too much bread today. I thought your family might like some." Eli looked at her, silent and wary. Then, before he could speak, Annie appeared beside him. Her eyes lit up as she smelled the warm bread. "Bread?" she whispered, her small voice filled with wonder. Clara smiled gently and unwrapped the cloth. The smell of fresh bread filled the cold air. "Yes, sweetheart," she said kindly, "still warm." Annie's eyes widened. Luke appeared next, curious and cautious. Clara knelt, smiling at them both. "Would you like some?" For the first time in months, laughter, soft, shy laughter, echoed inside that lonely cabin. Eli stood frozen, watching. Something in his chest shifted, something he hadn't felt in a long, long time. Clara looked up at him and asked quietly, "May I come in? It's awfully cold out here." He hesitated, then stepped back, opening the door wider. "Come in," he said gruffly. "You can stay for supper." Eli woke before dawn, the same way he always did. The world outside was still and cold, the snow lying thick and silent across the plains. He dressed quietly and stepped out into the dark, his breath white in the air. The animals still needed feeding. The fences still needed mending, grief or no grief. The land didn't wait for a man's sorrow. Inside the cabin, the light from the fire flickered over the faces of the children and the woman who had fallen asleep in the chair by the hearth, Clara Bennett. She had stayed the night after the snowstorm began, refusing to risk the long walk back to town. Her head rested against the chair back, her shawl slipping off one shoulder, a book open in her lap. Even in sleep, there was a gentleness about her that made the room feel different, warmer somehow. When Eli came back inside after tending the stock, he paused in the doorway. Something stopped him. It was the sound. Laughter. Small, bright, unexpected laughter. He stepped quietly into the room. Annie was sitting on the floor beside Clara, who was reading from her small book, her voice soft and full of life. Luke sat close, his carving knife forgotten, as he listened. "See this letter?" Clara was saying, pointing at the page. "It makes the sound, B, like in bread or boy." "B," Annie repeated carefully, her lips forming the sound. Clara smiled. "Very good. Now what word is this?" Quote, "Boy," Luke said, his voice quiet but proud. "Excellent, Luke." Clara beamed. "You're both clever as can be." Annie giggled when Clara puffed her cheeks and buzzed like a bumblebee. Luke laughed too, and for a moment the cabin felt alive again. Eli stood still, afraid to breathe, afraid to break the spell. It had been so long since he had heard that sound in this house. Children's laughter, warmth, life. He didn't understand how this woman, a stranger, had brought it all back in one night. When Clara finally looked up and saw him standing there, she smiled uncertainly. "Good morning, Mr. Carter," she said softly. "The children and I were just keeping busy." He nodded stiffly and moved to the stove. "Storm's letting up. You should be able to get back to town today." Her smile faltered. "Of course," she said quietly, gathering her things. But as she stood, Annie's hand caught the edge of her skirt. "Will you come back?" the little girl asked. Clara looked down at her and hesitated. "If your uncle says I may," she said gently. Eli turned at the sound of Annie's voice. Both children were watching him with wide, pleading eyes. His throat tightened. He wasn't good with words, but he couldn't ignore that look. "If you have the time," he said gruffly, not meeting Clara's eyes. A bright, grateful smile broke across her face. "Then I'll come back tomorrow," she said, and she did. From that day on, Clara Bennett became part of their world. She came every few days to teach the children their letters and numbers, bringing small things: a jar of jam, a mended shirt, a loaf of her famous bread. She filled the cabin with something Eli had long forgotten: peace. But peace was not what the town of Prairie Creek offered her. Word spread fast. The women whispered behind her back when she passed. "She's setting her cap for him," Mrs. Beasley said. "Think she'll tame that wild man and claim his land." "She's practically living there," Mrs. Gable added with a snort. "A teacher ought to set a better example." Quote, the gossip spread like wildfire. Clara tried to ignore it, but she felt the eyes on her when she walked through town. The cold shoulders, the forced smiles. It stung, but she held her head high. She told herself the work mattered more than the whispers. At the ranch, Eli was fighting his own battles. The winter had been cruel. The cattle were thin, the wheat patch ruined by frost. The debts left by his brother's bad choices weighed heavy. He worked from sunrise to sunset, but the numbers still didn't add up. Every night, he went to bed exhausted. Every morning woke with the same gnawing fear. He was failing. Then one evening, everything nearly came undone. He was in the barn trying to shoe a restless mare when she kicked out, her hoofs slamming into his ribs. The pain was like fire. He collapsed, gasping for breath. It was Clara who found him. She had arrived for the children's lesson and found him half conscious in the stall. "Eli," she cried, rushing to his side. "You're hurt." "I'm fine," he rasped, trying to get up, but she pressed a firm hand to his shoulder. "Don't be foolish." With Luke's help, she got him back to the cabin. His breath came in ragged gasps. "Your ribs are broken," she said, her brow furrowed with worry. "We need to bind them." He tried to argue, but the pain silenced him. She tore a clean sheet into strips and began wrapping them around his chest. Her touch was gentle but steady, her face close to his. He could feel her breath against his skin, smell the faint scent of soap and bread on her. When she was done, she looked into his face. "You need rest," she said softly. He nodded, unable to find words. The children watched from the loft, their small faces filled with fear. Clara turned to them, her voice calm. "Your uncle will be all right. He just needs to heal." That night, when the pain and fever came, Clara sat by his side. She wiped the sweat from his brow, spooned him water, and whispered to him when he tossed and turned. In his half-conscious state, he spoke words he hadn't said aloud in years. "I told him to go," he murmured, his voice hoarse. "Told him to go chase his foolish dream. Never said goodbye. My fault. My fault." Clara's eyes filled with tears. She took his hand, her voice low and soothing. "You did not cause it, Eli. You did not." He quieted, her presence steady as the fire beside them. She stayed awake all night, holding his hand while the wind howled outside. By morning, his fever broke. He opened his eyes to find her still sitting there, her hand wrapped around his. Her head had nodded forward, her hair falling loose, and she was asleep in the chair. He looked at her for a long time. The sunlight touched her face, soft and peaceful, and something inside him shifted again, something slow and careful, but alive. In the days that followed, he healed, and life slowly took on a new rhythm. Clara kept coming, and the children began to laugh more. Annie followed her everywhere. Luke carved her little animals out of wood. The cabin that had once been silent now echoed with voices and laughter. Sometimes, in the evenings, Eli would find Clara sitting by the fire with the children asleep beside her. They would talk quietly, the kind of talk that made time slow down. She told him about her late husband, a kind man who had died of fever back east. He told her about his brother, the wild one who'd never stayed put. They sat there, two people shaped by loss, finding a fragile kind of peace in each other's company. But peace doesn't last long in small towns. One morning as Clara walked to the general store, she felt every eye on her. The whispers had grown louder, crueler. "She's living out there alone with him," someone hissed. 3 nights snowed in, they say. Clara kept walking, but her heart ached. She had come west to escape pity, not to invite scandal. That evening, Eli returned from town with bruises on his face and dried blood on his knuckles. Clara gasped when she saw him. "What happened?" He wiped at his mouth. "A man said something he shouldn't have," he said simply, "about you." Her eyes widened. "You fought for me?" He shrugged, his jaw tight. "No one talks about you that way." She looked at him for a long moment, her heart full and aching. "You didn't have to." "Maybe not," he said, his voice rough. "But I wanted to." Quote. She reached for the wet cloth and gently cleaned the cut on his cheek. Her hands trembled slightly, but her voice stayed calm. "You shouldn't get yourself hurt over talk," she whispered. Eli looked down at her, at the kindness in her eyes. "Let them talk," he said quietly. "They don't know the truth." For a moment, neither moved. The air between them felt thick, full of things unspoken. And for the first time since he buried his brother, Eli Carter felt something that wasn't grief. He felt hope. Spring came to the Wyoming plains in fits and starts, muddy and wild, as if the land didn't quite trust the warmth yet. The snow melted into rushing creeks, the air smelled of thawing earth, and the sky seemed impossibly wide again. But inside Eli Carter's chest, that old weight had returned. The bank's letter sat folded on the table, heavy as an iron nail. If he couldn't pay by summer, they would lose the ranch. He worked harder than ever. Long into the evenings, his ribs still sore from winter, his hands bleeding from cold tools. Clara saw it. She saw the lines deepening around his eyes, the way his shoulders hunched like a man carrying too much. One afternoon, when she brought lessons for the children, she found him in the barn, standing beside the last of his cattle. "You're selling them?" she said quietly. He didn't look at her. "It's my business." Her voice rose, trembling. "Your business? This is your brother's land. These are his children. This is our life now, Eli." He turned then, anger flashing in his pale eyes. "You think your bread and kind words can fix a ranch that's dying? You don't understand this land. You don't understand what it's like to watch everything slip away no matter how hard you fight." Her hands clenched at her sides. "And you don't understand that fighting alone isn't strength. It's pride. You think you're the only one who's lost something? You're not the only soul in this house carrying ghosts." The words hung between them, sharp and heavy. They both breathed hard, the air thick with everything they couldn't say. Then a small sound cut through the silence. A frightened gasp. Annie stood by the barn door, her tiny hands shaking. She had heard the shouting. Her wide eyes brimmed with tears. Before either of them could speak, she turned and ran, straight out across the yard, toward the rolling hills. "Annie!" Clara screamed, her voice breaking. Eli was already running. His boots slipped in the mud as he chased the small figure darting across the darkening fields. The sun was sinking fast, the air turning cold. Panic rose like fire in his chest. They searched the hills, calling her name until their throats were raw. When darkness came, Eli spotted something. A flash of movement near the creek. He stumbled down the embankment and saw her, huddled on a patch of wet ground, trapped by the swollen, roaring water. "Annie!" he shouted. Her small voice answered through the rush of the current. "Uncle Eli, I'm scared!" He didn't think. He just moved. The water was icy and fierce, but he waded in anyway. The current fought him, dragging at his legs, but he pushed forward, reaching the girl. He scooped her up, clutching her tight against his chest, her small body trembling from the cold. When he reached the bank, Clara was there, her face pale and streaked with tears. Together they wrapped Annie in Eli's coat and carried her back to the cabin. Clara built a fire, her hands steady though her heart was shaking. Eli sat on the floor, holding Annie in his arms, whispering her name over and over. "You're safe, sweetheart. You're safe now." When the girl finally drifted to sleep, he looked up at Clara. She knelt beside him, exhaustion and relief in her eyes. Without thinking, he reached for her hand. She took it, their fingers twining together like they were meant to fit. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice breaking. "For the anger, for the fear, for all of it." Clara shook her head. "You were scared," she said softly. "So was I." He drew her close, his forehead resting against hers. "You and these children, you're all I have left. I don't want to lose that. I don't want to lose you." Her breath caught and she looked at him, eyes shining in the firelight. "Then don't," she whispered. He kissed her then, slowly, gently, the way a man does when he's afraid the world might vanish around him. It wasn't fiery or rushed. It was honest. It was a promise. From that night on, something in the Carter home changed. The air seemed lighter, the laughter easier. Clara stayed, not as a visitor, but as part of the family. She taught lessons in the mornings and helped Eli in the fields by afternoon. Luke followed his uncle everywhere, learning the land. Annie trailed behind Clara, carrying baskets of eggs and giggling when the hens chased her. But the town didn't forget. Prairie Creek was small, and gossip clung like dust. When Clara went into town, the women whispered behind her back. One morning she arrived at the schoolhouse to find the words "Sinner Woman" smeared in tar across the door. Eli rode into town the next day, his jaw set, and found the banker's son, the same young man who'd laughed about Clara months before. He dragged him by the collar into the street. "You clean that door and you apologize to her," Eli said in a low, dangerous voice. The boy's father, Mr. Gable, stood across the street watching, red-faced and furious. "You'll regret this, Carter," he shouted. Maybe Eli did regret it later, but not in that moment. The banker called in his loan early. He gave them a week to leave the ranch. Clara wept that night. "I've brought this on you," she said through tears. "If I hadn't stayed—" Eli took her hands in his. "If you hadn't stayed, we'd have nothing worth fighting for," he said quietly. Still, the next morning, he found her letter on the table. She had gone. She'd written that she loved him, but couldn't be the reason his home was taken. He saddled his horse in the dark and rode hard through the rain, following the faint tracks of her boots and wagon wheels. The storm broke around him, thunder rolling over the plains. He found her near the creek, huddled beside a broken wagon, soaked and shivering. He jumped from his horse and strode through the rain toward her. "You think leaving will save us?" he shouted over the wind. "I lost my brother once because I said nothing. I won't lose you the same way." Quote. Clara looked up, tears mixing with the rain. "Eli!" He pulled her into his arms, holding her tight against him. "You are my family," he said fiercely. "You, Luke, and Annie. This is your home. If the world wants to take it, they'll have to take me too." And then he kissed her, there in the rain, both of them trembling but alive. The next months were not easy. They worked harder than ever. Clara baked and traded her bread for supplies. Eli bartered cattle for seed and lumber. Slowly, bit by bit, they rebuilt what life had taken. The ranch survived, not because of luck, but because they refused to let it die. By the time the next autumn came, the land had changed. The grass grew thick again, the wheat fields golden and strong. Luke was taller, Annie's laughter filled the air, and Clara's bread baked warm in the oven every morning. One evening, Eli led Clara, Luke, and Annie up the small hill behind the barn. The wind was soft, the sun low and gold. 3 wooden crosses stood there, weathered by time. He placed his hand on his brother's and said quietly, "I did right by them, John. I kept my promise." Clara stood beside him, her hand slipping into his. Annie held her skirt. Luke stood proud and straight beside his uncle. The pain in Eli's chest lifted like fog leaving the valley. For the first time, he felt peace. That night, as the fire crackled, Clara mended Luke's shirt while Eli watched her from his chair. He finally spoke what had lived inside him for months. "You changed everything," he said softly. She looked up and smiled, her eyes shining in the lamplight. "It was already here, Eli. The warmth, the goodness. It was just waiting for you to see it again." He reached for her hand. "I see it now," he said. Outside, the Wyoming wind still blew across the plains, but inside that small cabin, it was warm. Laughter and love filled the air where silence used to live. And for the first time in a long, long while, Eli Carter believed that the land could give back what it had once taken away.